Arrendell is a preacher, writer, entrepreneur, and Emmy award-winning journalist. She believes in storytelling as a powerful tool for healing and change. Whether she's in the pulpit, the streets, the classroom, or on the stage, Minister Ryan Lindsay leads with love to connect with those around her. Her forthcoming book, Mind the Unseen, explores abortion as a pathway to healing while navigating the reality of choosing to have an abortion as a Black Christian woman in America. Her TEDx talk, A Hashtag Isn't Enough, utilizes empathy to draw a connection between anti-Blackness and abortion. She is a graduate of Yale Divinity School and Newton Seminary. It's early. UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, and Northwestern University, where she majored in journalism and African American studies. Minister Ryan Lindsay serves the Double Love Experience Church, also known as DLE, in Brooklyn, New York, where she will be ordained in November 2024. She's a recipient of DLE's Hall King Award for Ministerial Service, Advocacy, and Commitment to Justice and Deep Love for God's People. Minister Ryan Lindsay answered her call to ministry in May 2019 while working as a journalist for an NPR affiliate station in Hartford, Connecticut. Originally from Washington, D.C., she preached her first sermon as a teenager during a youth Sunday service at Zion Baptist Church. An accomplished entrepreneur, Minister Ryan Lindsay's brand, Gloss Rags, gained notoriety for the And Counting collection, a series of apparel that memorialized Black folks slain by police and those culpable of anti-Blackness. The collection, which debuted in April 2014, featured the names of over 30 sisters and brothers, was laid to rest in 2018. Essence, Fast Company, The Fader, Complex, and other outlets have all covered Gloss Rags. Minister Ryan Lindsay is the daughter of Reverend Donna and Edward Carlton II, the granddaughter of the late Pasty Lee and Stanley Jenkins, and Barbara Lee and Edward Carlton I, the sister of Edward Chad, and the mother of two angels, Joy and Mercy. She's also auntie to three wonderful humans, Maya, Calvin, and Naomi. The scripture for Minister Ryan Lindsay's current season of life is Romans 12:12. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. Please join me in welcoming Minister Ryan Lindsay. Okay, so in your amazing bio, you mentioned that your first sermon was as a teenager during a youth service at Zion Baptist Church. So I'm going to bring it all the way back and ask if you could talk about your earliest memory of wanting to pursue a career in ministry and advocacy work.
Yeah, I think I don't have one specific memory. My mother was faithful to raise my brother and I in church. So I'm born and raised in DC, but we lived all over, Santa Fe for a little bit, North Carolina, and then back to the DC area. And I think there was something about being in the Black Baptist Church context that really illuminated things for me. The vibrancy, the energy, the spirit. And so when I was younger, participated in Awanas, if anybody knows Awanas, and different kind of, there's a youth ministry where it was a non-denominational church where we were learning how to give our testimonies and speak to, how God was moving in our life, accepting Christ. And I think all of those building blocks, even just like I accepted Christ at a Billy Graham conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was 1997. I just walked up to the stage and said, that I was ready, really, without any prompting or pressure from my mom. So I think by the time I got to this Black Baptist church in DC, these building blocks had built this firm foundation for me to an extent, and being extended the opportunity to preach as a teenager had an imprint on me. And I guess if the slide is ready, we could show it. But
sure.
When it'll come up, this was something that it was a list, and you'll see it in a second, where I had these 3 columns that said I want to be. And so there are all types of things. And I found it when I was going through boxes of things at my grandmother's house. So she passed away a year ago, or 6 years ago, yesterday. And I just was amazed because this was something I drew, I think, when I was like 15 or 16 years old. It's a very poorly drawn Nike Cortez sneaker. And maybe you can zoom in a little bit, but there's all these things that I wanted to be. A drummer, Jamaican, a champion eater, a food critic, which we talked about a little bit yesterday with Leslie. My mom took, it's funny passing the Bahama Breeze. There was one in Raleigh, and so I had written this food review when I was like 9, and she takes me there, she printed it out, and she gives it to the server, and they like comp the whole meal, and they give me a little gold pineapple pen that I still have. So I was like, oh yeah, like Bon Appetit needs me on their staff at 9. But, you know, a singer, an optimist, and then there are things like, you know, adjectives, adverbs, secure, strong, safe, free, dimensional, deep, grateful. But then I noticed, like, right in the middle, I don't know if y'all see, sandwiched in between a model and a hairstylist, it says a preacher. And so something, that teenage version of me was listening for and to God, and all of these years later, kind of circling back to now being a preacher is pretty wild, but I'm very grateful. I have done some of those things on the list, but I think there was something about being extended that opportunity to preach as a teenager that really stayed with me. And, you know, preaching is a lot like storytelling, and obviously is a very powerful form of public speaking. So again, even though I didn't go right into divinity school or didn't continue to preach throughout my 20s, I still, that seed was planted and it still was watered over these years to where I am now.
Could you talk a little bit about the intersection of your advocacy work and those building blocks to get you to where you are now?
Yeah. So my mother is an educator, and I was born in DC, and then we lived in Santa Fe in like the early 90s, early to mid 90s. And so my brother and I were the only black kids in our school, so we went to a private Christian school for a little while. And so she really created like Saturday school for us. So we were watching Eyes on the Prize at a young age. I had books that had paper dolls that you could cut out, and they were all about like black seamstresses and designers and things like that. Our books were black books, so whether it was Amazing Grace or learning about John Henry and the Railroad, all these different, Anansi the Spider, my mom was very intentional about exposing us. And even in North Carolina, there's a town that has a population of 66, but they have a Buffalo Soldier museum, and it was also where Billy the Kid was shot and killed. But she took us there just to continue to expose us to our history wherever we were. And then every summer we were always in DC with my grandparents, just being in what used to be known as Chocolate City, but it's like mocha now, or I don't know, caramel macchiato. But it's still like the soul of my hometown is still very black. But I digress. So she really exposed us to a lot. And then, so it was kind of funny. I went to high school and middle school in Montgomery County, Maryland. Large Jewish population, but also very diverse county. And so I had an 8th grade civil rights class, and I remember I got kicked out of class because I fell asleep. But we were watching Eyes on the Prize. I was like, I saw this about 8 years ago. So I got put out, but then I remember specifically being awake during the episode that covers Emmett Till and his murder. And so the difference between, kind of seeing that as like an 8-year-old versus being again about seeing that, making connections in my own life. And we had, things were happening in the world. When I was in high school, if y'all remember the Gina 6, that was really eye-opening for me, and we did some kind of advocacy around that in my high school. When I was a little bit older, of course, the Flint water crisis happened, so I was able to go down to Flint twice in 2016 and 2017 with Alfred Street Baptist Church in Virginia, and be hands on the ground, delivering water. And this small Flint missionary Trinity Baptist Church, they were giving out more water than the city. They were giving out more water than the state. They had churches shipping pallets and big trucks of water, like renting those big trucks and driving them to Flint to make sure that everyone was getting water, getting food. And so seeing these things continues to be very impactful to me in terms of seeing what it looks like, not just to read the Beatitudes, but to live them out in a lot of ways. So that's my thought.
Yeah, no, thank you. So it sounds like you have been exposed to different environments. You have been a leader throughout all of those different stages of life, whether that be in church or outside of church. So what does it look like and feel like to be an emerging leader, like during today's climate, both in the church and outside of the church?
It feels exciting. It feels daunting because I think, especially as a Black woman in ministry, there are models, but I don't necessarily know that there's a model that exists for me in the sense that there's women that I look at and just folks in ministry that I admire, Dr. Michelle Goodry, Reverend Dr. Gabby Cujo-Wilkes, Gina Stewart, Reverend Claudette Copeland, and a lot of the contemporaries in terms of the preaching fire that they have, the innovation, the way that they have charted new paths so that I could be doing what I'm doing. But I think the part that, kind of scares me a little bit is even just really being out here. I was saying, I think the other day when we were at dinner, I think the church has, sexuality in the church seems less stigmatized at this point in time than abortion. And that I know is a part of my testimony and what God is calling me to do, the work that God is calling me to do. And so that feels scary in a way because there's still so much tension around something that is actually quite common. 1 in 4 women have abortions. And so that feels daunting. But I'm also very excited to have the support from ABMHS and even my family and folks around me. It's just, it's quite a time. But I do think, echoing what you said, Dr. Jeff, we do need that support. We do need the resources. We do need people to say, I see you, and I might be uncomfortable with what you're doing, or this might not be the way I want to do it or go about it. But I see you and I support you. That means the world, because the world, this was something that Reverend Melva Sampson said at Proctor in February in Atlanta, was that people are dying. And I'll never forget that. And it's the truth. Every day people are dying. And we are meant to be those people, not just trying to triage, but to be walking out as much as we possibly can, doing things, saying things, advocating for things that are life-giving, that are not just about keeping people from dying, but helping people live life and life to the full, like it talks about in John 10:10. So it is a tall order to be emerging in this time, but I also feel very grateful because one of the things that I realized just coming out of journalism is that my voice feels so much more free in ministry than it did in journalism, which is quite ironic because journalism is supposed to all be about, the First Amendment, but when you're Black in America, it's very different. And especially, having covered police shootings on my job, having covered the aftermath, the 7-year anniversary of Sandy Hook a few years ago, I just had exposure, domestic gun violence, a lot of different things, but to be able to not just have a voice, but to use it makes a world of a difference.
Yeah, last night at dinner, we went out to dinner yesterday with some of the Intercultural Ministries team and with Kerwin, and we were talking, about, just because we both share degrees in journalism, about how in journalism school they teach you you are a voice to the voiceless. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about the fact that everybody has a voice. It's about providing a platform for them, regardless of the communities that you belong to, and using the resources that you have available. And listening, like you said. Exactly, mm-hmm. Listening, and not just hearing, and then acting upon it, mm-hmm. Which is very hard to do in the structure of journalism, where you're right. supposed to be, unbiased, mm-hmm. and all of these things that people are just not, because we're all human.
Right.
And so I know you touched a little bit on your project that ABHMS has provided a grant for. Do you mind maybe explaining a little bit more about what that encompasses?
Absolutely. So the working title is So We Might Speak. And the might is really operative because I personally have been able to experience a lot of freedom from being able to share my abortion story publicly. But I understand that not everyone would choose to do so, and that's totally fine. But I think having an opportunity to recount how did you experience your abortion, whether it was 5, 10, 20, 50 years ago, right? Understanding what your experience was, especially because I find that a lot of women have not had an opportunity to talk about it because of the shame, because of the stigma, because of the grief. And so I'm working on creating a curriculum, a spiritual care guide, and a pastoral care guide for women who've had abortions. And so that requires one-on-one interviews. It requires creating things that don't exist. If your churches have grief share groups, they're not really thinking about this type of grief as something that would be welcome or even incorporated in their own existing curriculum. And so there's a deep need for this, and I'm excited to do the work because usually when I self-disclose, 9 times out of 10, another woman is sharing that she's also had an experience, but knowing there's such a vast, like I call it like an ocean of emotions that come with making a singular decision. Some women make the decision multiple times, but the stigma around it is so heavy and so deep. And so that is the work, I don't want to misquote. There's someone, it might be Audre Lorde or Zora Neale Hurston, who says that I think it's Audre Lorde in Search of Our Mother's Garden, who says that we have to do the work that our soul must have. And I realized that in a great place of privilege, because this is not something that women in my generation and my legacy have been able to do because they were doing the caretaking, because they were getting the good job that would provide stability, because they were being stay-at-home mothers. And so now this is my call, and my part of the legacy is to do that work. And so with the curriculum and the spiritual care guide and the pastoral care guide is really about equipping pastors, equipping clergy to it's not really about having a conversation, but it is about the listening, the deep listening that doesn't bring a place of judgment, or even everybody, I think, has their own theology around abortion. And that's not the point. The point is to listen and to allow women to have space to share their experiences, to try and make sense and make meaning out of, again, a singular choice that does change your life, but also doesn't necessarily define your life. Like I sit here being proud to say that I carry my twins with me wherever I go. They were with me in California, they're with me in Hartford, they're with me now. And but that hasn't, defined me. Like there's, God always has more in store for us and is with us, in those valleys, in the mountaintops. And so that's really the work that I'm endeavoring to do at this season, and I'm really excited and again grateful for the support to be able to go where the stories are and go where the people are, and put these resources together. Because I even noticed just in my preliminary research, there's not actually like a wealth of pastoral care guides by and for Black people. Too Heavy a Yoke is a book by Reverend Dr. Shaniqua Barnes that speaks to some of the particular challenges that Black women in the church experience. Marla Frederick's book about Between Sundays and Everyday Struggles of Church Women also kind of speak to some of those labors. And then there's Pastoral Care in the Age of Black Lives Matter, which was edited by Danielle Bahuro. But in terms of really concerted resources about how we can be caring for each other pastorally in community in addressing some of the specific challenges that are all tied up in systemic racism, tied up in systemic oppression. Those resources are lacking. And also, of course, the stigmatized issues, right? Like there was just one chapter called Changing the Conversation in the Spiritual Care in the Age of Black Lives Matter, which I read for my Intro to Pastoral Care class like 3 years ago. But that one chapter was like 12, 16 pages, maybe, left an imprint and was a seed, because I was like, okay,
favorite book, The House on Mango Street by
Mm-hmm.
Sandra Cisneros, and there's a vignette in the book that talks about, as you are paving a way, this is my own words, as you are paving a way, it's important to look back and offer that same pathway
Mm-hmm.
to those who come after you. And so I'm thinking of the lens of like being an emerging leader and you listing all of these concrete resources that you have been able to tap into,
Right.
and then you also creating resources from that for those who will come after you is super important. So I just want to affirm your work.
Thank you.
And also ask if you have any piece of advice for ABHMS staff as we continue to try to support sustainable ministries that may be a little bit outside of the box type of a thing, but engage with emerging leaders like yourself.
Yeah. Well, I honestly was really thinking a lot about what you said yesterday about it's not about giving voice to the voiceless, but it's about listening. And then something that was said at the Proctor Institute, which I was blessed to go to because of ABMHS over the summer in Tennessee, was to take the needs of the people seriously and to treat them seriously, because it is, for a lot of people, it is life and death, right? Like, not just living paycheck to paycheck, but the way that there's a particular violence of poverty and the way that poverty drives you to make decisions that could be perceived as dangerous or unethical or immoral because you are trying to provide, because you're trying not to give up. But then the church is so quick to judge those decisions, those choices, but they're not walking in your shoes. They're not crying at night trying to figure out how to make men's eat meat, right? They're not hearing you cry out to God when you don't know what to do, where you've tried everything, where the bank account is overdrawn, the job has gone away, right? Like, I really hope that the church will surrender its ego and understand, like, what does it look like to meet someone where they're at? What does it look like to embody a come as you are ethic? What does it look like to say, no, I actually trust that you know what you're talking about because you're living it every day, versus saying, well, this is what the Bible says, or this is how we've done it, or design thinking says this, or strategic organizational theory says that. Like, no, what does it mean to say I trust you because you are living this out, and we can work together, right? I can provide the resources, I can provide, we can try something different. So I think just the listening, the going outside of your comfort zone, we really do have so much privilege. Like, so I have privilege, we have privilege, and it requires something a friend talked about a few years ago, is this notion of productive discomfort. What does it look like to be uncomfortable? I had the opportunity to pastor a predominantly white UCC church for 5 months while their pastor was on sabbatical, and every Sunday in July I was wearing these shirts that Emmett, Amadou, Sean, Oscar, Trayvon, these names, and the list would get longer every Sunday. So it started with 6, and then by the end of the month we were at 17. So like Freddie Gray was towards the bottom, Tamir Rice, and then Alton Sterling and Philando Castillo were on the back. And so I had a woman write me, one of the women in the congregation, and she was like, church hasn't felt a lot he was quoting Frank, I think it's Frank Stewart, about how to preach a dangerous sermon. But he was saying that preaching is a terrible joy. And that stuck with me, and I said, well, to the woman, respectfully, I was via email. I was like, first of all, Scripture says in Psalm 91 that we're to find sanctuary in the Most High. So number one, the church is not the sanctuary. It is a sanctuary, but it's not the sanctuary. And then number two, that for Black people, historically, the church has been a sanctuary and a place of respite from the daily ills of racism. And so for her to, it was sort of trying to gently point out the privilege that was present. It was like, I have to come and preach in front of you all for 5 months and be very uncomfortable. And like that sermon series, I was sweating through my t-shirt every Sunday. But, for them, for white folks, especially those who might have like a Black Lives Matter lawn sign or may have donated in the wake of George Floyd's murder, or, you know, vote blue or what have you, like, there's still this level of comfort that is afforded to them just by the sheer reality of being white in this country, right? But to then have that stirred, have yourself stirred, where you're, the good things, the good works that you have done, don't comfort you, cannot quiet the stirring that's on the inside, I think is worthwhile. And it's not an easy task, but I think when we can push ourselves to be uncomfortable on a regular basis, then we are actually like living out the ethic of Christ, who's amongst people that are being talked about, that he's being lied on all the time, he's being accused all the time, his knowledge of the scriptures is being questioned, you know, by people who say that they're part of the church, right? The Pharisees said they're supposed to be the ones who uphold and live it out, but they were just quick to judge, very hypocritical. So I think if we can, as leaders, but also as people who have made mistakes, who have come up short, who are still wrestling with our faith, I would hope on a daily basis that we can really try and think about, like, what does it look like for me to be uncomfortable today, and who can I be in service of today? What does it look like for me to pick up my cross today and move forward and doing the work that God has called us to do? So that's what I would offer to you all. And again, I'm just very grateful to be here, and for this opportunity to, I have to take Dr. Jeff and Kerwin, because I hadn't been writing other than papers, which is very different than, you know, writing with my heart and my voice and my spirit. So I'm really grateful to be contributing to the Christian Citizen again, and it's this kind of homecoming that's been happening. So I just thank you all very much that I have that opportunity.
Before I let you go, now that you mentioned that you've been writing for the Christian Citizen, do you mind sharing a little bit about, I believe it's 3 articles that you've written so far?
Yeah, so the first one, the title is borrowed from a Langston Hughes poem that I didn't know about until being at the farm. So it's called Kids Who Die, is the name of the poem, Kids Who Die, Adults Who Contribute. So it talks about our complicity in a lot of ways of children's deaths that are happening on a daily basis, whether it's increasing suicide rates, whether it's systemic gun violence, there's abuse, neglect, like there's so many ways that we, I have to say we, because we are culpable, don't contribute to the flourishing of children, which is something that Dr. Starsky talked a lot about, in Prathia Hall as well. And then the second article borrows from Psalm 37, contend, O Lord, with those who contend with me. And so it talks about just like the often daily misconduct that folks in the cloth, men in particular, make women in ministry feel uncomfortable in the bodies that God has given us. So I talked through that. And then this piece, which I'll share with you all, some of it today, was just about wrestling with grief and lament, and the challenge that it is to be honest with God when you don't agree with what God has decided to do in the timeline. So yeah, those are my 3 pieces.
Thank you. That's an awesome segue for you to share your devotion with us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just invite you first to just pray with me. God, won't you bless those who are poor and realize their need for you? For the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God, won't you bless those who mourn and help them to know that they will be comforted? God, won't you continue to bless those who are humble and help them to understand that they will inherit the earth? God, won't you bless those who hunger and thirst for justice and help them to know that they will be satisfied? God, won't you bless those who are merciful and give them mercy? God, won't you bless those whose hearts are pure and help them to see you daily? God, won't you bless those who work for peace and help them to understand that they are your children wherever they are? God, help us to know that those of us who are persecuted for doing right is a reality, but that the kingdom of heaven is ours. God, help us to be strength and strengthen and remember that we are blessed when we are mocked, and that people will mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things about you because we are followers of you. But help us, O God, to be glad. Help us to be happy, and remember that a great reward awaits us. And remember that those that walked with you in the past were persecuted in the same way. In your name we pray. Amen. I'm going to read a couple excerpts from the piece that just came out. It's called "I Put My Grief in a Suitcase." My grandmother died in a way that felt wildly unfair, suddenly suffering and literally without a voice. She'd been withering away in the months leading up to November 2017, her plush arms becoming thin, her full face not quite gaunt, but hauntingly close. I was not used to this version of my grandma, ornery, withdrawn, and much too quiet. I'd come home to D.C. from California for Thanksgiving, aware that my grandma was in the hospital, but unaware of all that would happen next. We spent Thanksgiving doing something we never did nor wanted to do, eating Thanksgiving dinner at a restaurant. The mac and cheese on the plate before me surely was not my grandma's mac and cheese, nor was it the familiar warmth of her home and its dinner table with burgeoning plates of home-cooked goodness. The prayer was said by Auntie, her older sister, who always prayed so fervently but much too long. Though we always chuckled about this, trying not to laugh as we peeked at each other across the table, heads bowed but smiles wide. This was a loud, crowded restaurant with a cheer that felt disingenuous. I did not remember who prayed over the meal that year. It is December 13th, 2017, and we are gathered around Grandma's bed praying. She is leaving us, transitioning, going to be with the Lord. Grandma is dying. Grandma is dead. It is December 22nd, 2017, and we are at Grandma's funeral weeping. She'd not cry at my grandpa's funeral 4 years before hers, or my uncle's 8 years before hers. I did not know what lament looked like in my grandma's life, though I woke up many mornings hearing her listen to Dr. Charles Stanley's voice through the radio and clapped alongside her so many Sundays in church. Grief does not have much regard for time, and time does not have much regard for grief. I'd been gone from California nearly 6 weeks, and the start of my last semester in my graduate journalism program was just around the corner. That January, I put my grief in a suitcase and flew back to California. And when I landed in Oakland, I recited the platitudes of good Christian grief like a script. I know that God's healing doesn't always mean that the person gets to stay here on earth. I'm glad she's no longer suffering. Meanwhile, a devastating diploma arose in my mind. Every time I received a diploma, someone close to me died. In high school, my uncle, college, my grandfather, and now in grad school, even before I could graduate, my grandma. She was supposed to be here. I was mad at God, resentful even, fed up with losing those who I loved the most, those who saw me, those who understood me, those who loved me. Why tell God how I really felt if he already knew? You know it's tearing me apart that she's not here. You know I don't know what to do without her. You could have saved her. What am I doing in this world without my grandma? In his book, Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, Discovering the Grace of Lament, Mark Vrope writes, the silent treatment must end. Frustration and discouragement might tempt you to stop talking to God. Lament opens a door and shows you a path towards trust. And yet I felt betrayed by God. When I finally told God that, tears streaming down my face as I sat on a log, a door only lament could open unlocked. Grope writes, let lament do its work in your life. Don't stop talking to God. Keep wrestling, keep struggling, keep praying. It is a prayer of faith for the journey between a hard life and God's goodness. We need to learn to lament. Through the tears, the first step is to turn to God in prayers. Yet lament suggests that neither death nor grief have the final say, that there is something bewilderingly beautiful about being loved by a God who sincerely wants to hear all that we are thinking and feeling, even on the worst days, the days when we cannot choose or choose not to find words or to speak to the one who can and does empathize with us. Lament is a language of prayer that is rarely polished, poised, or even what we were taught is proper prayer. He writes, to pray in pain, even with its messy struggle and tough questions, is an act of faith where we open up our hearts to God. Prayerful lament is better than silence. I've lamented my way through my time at Yale Divinity School, crying out in both pain and gratitude because I am surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses and because my grandparents were not there to see me receive my MDiv in May. Yet I am becoming more fluent in the language of lament, learning its hollow vowels, complex conjugations, and myriad metaphors. And I thank God that God is still patiently listening for my voice, even when I really don't want to talk. Thank you.